Fortune favors the bold, which is why billionaire Eric Sprott and legendary investor Rick Rule are taking advantage of the lowest valuations in the mining sector in over 3 decades by accumulating millions of shares of this tiny new stock led by Keith Neumeyer, a mining entrepreneur who has already built 2 separate billion-dollar companies. This new venture, starting with 18 assets on day 1, including gold, silver, copper, and zinc projects, has already identified 60 additional quality assets in distressed companies that management will work to acquire. To learn more about this incredible opportunity, visit futuremoneytrends.com/fortune. Greetings and thank you for joining us at futuremoneytrends.com. I'm here with a very special guest. If you're concerned about an economic collapse, and a recent poll showed that about 70% of Americans are, our next guest is going to unleash some amazing intel that he has from a ridiculous amount of research. And he's also saying something that he has never said in the, I believe, 6 years of his blog. But he's actually been researching this stuff even longer. So our guest today is attorney Michael Snyder of the economiccollapseblog.com. He's also the author of The Beginning of the End. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's really great to be with you.
Michael, I've been a big reader of yours. All these bullet points. You're the grandmaster on the internet when it comes to the 10 reasons, the 16 reasons, the 15 reasons. Those are some amazing pieces and research, and you always cite the sources. And I just want to start off for everybody who reads your blog and is probably a fan of yours or gets information from you for other research that they might be doing themselves. How did this all start for you? What made you concerned going back? I don't know. Was it 5 years ago, 10 years? What initially what even put you on the path of looking into and investigating a possible economic collapse?
Yeah, well, back a decade ago, I was working as an attorney right in the heart of Washington, D.C., and I was just kind of your average D.C. worker. My wife and I, we lived across the river in Arlington, Virginia. Every morning I would get up, I would get dressed, I would go in, and I actually worked down on K Street, right in the belly of the beast. Sometimes on my lunch hour, I'd actually walk past the White House. That's how close I was. But as I'm working down there, I'm just seeing everything that's happening in our nation and with the economy, and I'm becoming increasingly distressed about what I'm seeing around me and the corruption and everything else. And so I thought, what in the world can I do? I'm just an average guy. I'm just going to work. How in the world can I make a difference? So eventually I thought about different things. I heard about this thing called blogging. So I thought, well, let me give that a try. So many other people are trying it. So I went on the internet and I set up a couple real small blogs and I started writing. And at first, hardly anyone took any notice of what I was doing, but I kept at it. And over time, and then at the end of 2009, I started up the economic collapse. Struck a chord because people were frustrated. They were losing their jobs because of the financial crisis that had just happened. They were losing their homes. They were being foreclosed on. Things were going crazy, and they knew they weren't getting straight answers, real answers from the mainstream media. So they were seeking out alternative sources of information. And so the Economic Collapse blog just really started to grow in popularity. And today it receives over 1 million page impressions each month. So it's an extraordinary amount of traffic. And then, of course, my articles are posted all over the internet where they're actually seen far more than on my website. So it's really amazing to me that from my home here in the mountains of Idaho, I can touch people, reach people with my writing all around the world. It's really amazing.
It's truly incredible, and you have to spend countless of hours, I imagine, because I know what it's like to research for a 6-minute micro documentary, and some of these articles you're writing, in fact, almost all your articles could be turned into a 6-minute micro documentary. Okay, so Michael, you have warned and shown a lot of evidence of why an economic collapse could be on its way, but for the first time on June 25th, you did something or said something that you had never done before. For the past 6 years, you have documented the collapse, but for the first time, you put out a very stark warning. You called it a red alert, going as far as saying a collapse in the last half of 2015 is imminent. Why?
Yeah, I've never done this before, but as an attorney, I'm trained to be level-headed, and I'm trained to only come to conclusions that are based on the evidence. And personally, as we came up toward the last half of 2015, just examining everything that I've been told, everything I've learned, everything I've researched in the process of producing more than 1,300 articles on the coming economic collapse, everything that I've gathered, all the data points were just screaming that there is a financial collapse is imminent within this 6-month time period, which actually starts today. And now when I put this out back on the 25th, this was before anything with Puerto Rico happened. It was before this situation with Greece kind of blew up and started going crazy, and before the Chinese markets were really going crazy. So, even a week later, things are really starting to unravel, and people are starting to say, oh yeah, I can see it. But even a week ago, I was getting a lot of heat for this, because to take a stand and to point to a particular point in time, usually when people do things like this, it doesn't work out too well. Usually people are wrong. So for me to do this, part of me really didn't want to, because it's kind of going out on a limb. And, if I were to be wrong, I would take a huge amount of criticism and lose credibility. But if you're going to issue some kind of warning like this, you've got to do it in advance. If you say when it's already happening, oh, it's coming, well, that doesn't do any good. If you say, oh, I knew it was coming when it was over, that is no good either. But I believe that a financial crisis is imminent, similar to what we saw in 2008, but eventually it's going to be much worse. And now when I say imminent, I'm not saying it's going to happen within the next 48 hours or within the next week. And so, I want people to understand it's for the entire 6-month period, this red alert. And then once we get to the end of 2015, I don't believe that it's all going to be over and that our problems are going to be past us. No, I believe that what we're entering into is a major turning point, financial crisis. But then in so many ways, our problems are just going to get beginning once we move into 2016.
How certain are you? I mean, if you were going to, is obviously you're pretty certain by putting this on your website publicly. You've never done anything like this. I mean, or I guess as someone who follows a lot of this information, I have seen so many of these predictions come from credible people, and I'm sure you have too. From Gerald Celente. I can't even think. The guy's name was Bob something. I can't think of his last name, but I've seen a lot of these predictions. So, and you have too. So I have to imagine that this was probably something you probably didn't want to do. I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, in certain ways, it almost kind of went against some of my, I want to say instincts, but actually my instincts were telling me to do this. But kind of my rational mind, in a sense, even though everything is telling me rationally that we're heading into this, there's part of me that wanted to play it safe, to be conservative, to say, well, is there any way that but I would not have done this if I was not exceedingly certain. And in my article where I made this pronouncement, I included just some of the information and charts and things that have led me to this conclusion. But to be honest, there are things that I didn't share. There's things that I am not able necessarily to release publicly at this time that also confirm how I reached my conclusion. So people go through the article and go through my information and say, okay, but is there something he's not telling us? Yes, there is. But I've tried to share as much as I can share. And so without a doubt, I believe that we're right on the precipice, right on the verge, and we started to see things, whether it's Puerto Rico, whether it's Greece. The Chinese markets were way down today. They're in bear market territory already. So Chinese markets actually have already been crashing over the past couple of weeks. So things are already moving in that direction, but this is a big deal, and this is a big stand for me to take. I understand that. But I would say for people out there who are listening, judge me when the 6 months are over. If nothing's happened, if if the last 6 months of 2015 are just like the first 6 months in 2014 and 2013, things that pretty much go along as normal, then hey, I'll admit I was wrong. But I would say, come back to me in January and then revisit what I've said.
Do you think it could be a 2008 type moment, but then the Fed comes in or all central banks come in and are able to mound enough digital currency and bailouts to almost kind of kick the can down another 7-8 years?
Well, the Bank for International Settlements came out the other day and said, really, the central banks are kind of out of ammunition. They're kind of defenseless to prevent the next round of financial problems, because they've already pushed interest rates. The Federal Reserve has pushed interest rates down to, as low as they can possibly go, as close to zero as possible. The central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, have already done tremendous quantitative easing. So they've already used up, so much of their ammunition. So the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks, was kind of very skeptical if they would be able to do that. I'm very skeptical. I believe that pretty much all the can kicking that can be done, has been done. And so I think when things start erupting, we will see a response. I believe initially we're going to see a great financial crisis, a credit crunch, which is so key because like we saw in 2008, all of a sudden the banks don't want to lend to one another or to anyone else. And all of a sudden the flow of money through our financial system is frozen up, and people can't get money. People can't get money for their businesses, and it causes all sorts of chaos. I think we're going to see a similar thing. But then in response, and it might be a matter of months or it might be longer depending on how governments and central banks respond, but I believe that we are going to see money printing, we are going to see stimulus and bailouts, and they're going to do all that they can to kind of get things going again. I believe that will eventually lead to the kind of inflation, even hyperinflation down the road that people have talked about. But I don't think that's the next stage of what we're going to see. I believe the initial stage that we're heading into next, in the next 6 months, is going to be a very sharply deflationary type of period during a financial crisis, when all of a sudden credit freezes up dramatically, and it's very hard for people to get money.
Yeah, that's a great point you just brought up, because I was actually going to ask you about the velocity of money chart you showed, because a lot of people think immediately there will be inflation, but what you just described and that chart you have of the velocity of money, it's very deflationary. Commodities are a leading indicator, specifically gold. And it does look like there could be severe inflation, especially if lending stops. I mean, we've seen severe inflation in the housing market for the past 5 years. But if the lending stopped, of course, we would see severe deflation. So just so I'm not putting words in your mouth, your belief or your most likely outcome of, after all the information you have studied for the last decade, the most likely crisis would be likely, and I say that because I know we're in unprecedented times, severe deflation followed by severe inflation or a currency crisis.
Yeah, exactly. And these things are going to happen quickly. So we're moving into a time when conditions are going to change very rapidly. There's going to be wild swings. But yeah, first, I believe we're going into deflation. It might be a relatively short period of time, but during this crisis, and then the response and how that plays out is going to lead us to the tremendous inflation down the road. But even when the central banks and everything, when they come in and they try to fix things up, I don't believe we're ever going to get back to the kind of stability and the debt-fueled prosperity that we're enjoying today. It's just going to be crisis after crisis and response after response. And I think that this time that when things fall apart, they're never going to really be able to put everything back together again the way that we have it today.
What, with all the research you've done, what sticks out? If there's one or two things you can share with us that might have been a discovery for you or a surprise about the state of our economy, something that kind of floored you and led you towards that imminent threat.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest things to me that I want to get across to people, because not a lot of people out there talk about it, is I want to talk about derivatives. And when I say that word, sometimes a lot of people just kind of tune out because they say, oh, derivatives, that sounds very complicated. And they can be very complex and very complicated. That's true. But at their core, it's very, very simple. And I like to try to break things down for people in a simple way that the average guy on the street can kind of grasp and understand. And derivatives at their core, to me, some people compare them to insurance contracts. But what I compare derivatives to is a form of legalized gambling. For example, when you buy stocks, you're buying an ownership interest in a company, you're investing in something real. When you invest in bonds, you're investing in the debt of a company. But derivatives, you're not investing in anything real, anything tangible at all. Essentially, what you're doing for most derivatives is you're essentially placing a bet that either something will or will not happen in the future. If it happens, if your bet is correct, you win money, but if it's incorrect, you lose money. Kind of like if I went to Las Vegas and I placed a bet that the Chicago Cubs would win the World Series this year, either I'd win or lose, and I'd either get money at the end or I would lose money at the end. So it's a similar thing. And over the past decade or so, Wall Street has been transformed into the greatest casino the world has ever seen. Instead of being focused on real investments in real companies, that, and it being about real things, it's just this wild gambling that's taking place. And at the heart of it are too big to fail banks. Back in 2008, we heard, these too big to fail banks, they kind of played a starring role in the financial crisis. And we were promised, oh, we're going to do something about too big to fail. We're going to fix this so it never happens again. Well, guess what happened? The too big to fail banks collectively have gotten 40% larger since the last time around. Meanwhile, 1,400 smaller banks have disappeared from the financial system. So the problem of too big to fail is now bigger than ever. And so you look at these too big to fail banks, and 5 of them, I'm talking about Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and JP Morgan Chase, each one of them has exposure to derivatives of at least $35 trillion. Now, keep in mind, the U.S. national debt is $18 trillion. So when you're talking about $35 trillion, that's an amount of money that's almost unimaginable. And yet these banks, their assets are far less than that. For example, JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in America, they've got total assets of about $2.6 trillion, but their exposure to derivatives is well over $50 trillion. And so these big banks, they're being exceedingly reckless. They're making all these wild bets. They're being all these wild financial instruments. And when they win big. They make a lot of money, and they usually do during stable times, during normal times, because their computer algorithms work pretty well when things are stable, when things are predictable. But when the markets start going against them, when markets start crashing, when we have black swan events, when things start going crazy, all of a sudden the computer algorithms, they don't work so well anymore, like we saw in 2008 with Lehman Brothers and others. So these big banks, if things stay stable, they'll probably be in fine shape. But when things start going crazy, like we're starting to see, all of a sudden the apple cart can start being overturned. And these big banks are exceedingly vulnerable. And it's not just them. I just wrote an article about the shadow banking system. The shadow banking system around the world, total globally, has $75 trillion in assets. And just in the United States, the shadow banking system has $24 trillion in assets. And so at this point, the shadow banking system is actually larger than the normal banking system. But the shadow banking system, they're largely unregulated. They're not guaranteed by the government. And so they're a lot more vulnerable. They're a lot more shaky. They're a lot more prone to collapse. And of course, the shadow banking system is very, very exposed to these derivatives as well. So this entire system has been built up that's extremely leveraged, that's extremely exposed, that's extremely vulnerable to market downturns, market collapses. And the whole system is designed to do well when the market is rising and going up. But if things start to fall, if we have a stock crash, a bond crash, then the financial devastation is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah, and the derivatives is a lot of people do tune out, and I have tried to explain it like this to people, and please correct me if I'm wrong, or if this is not a good analogy, but you take a company like, let's just take Allstate or any insurance company, and there's some, they provide fire insurance for homes. Well, this program, this business model works because not all homes burn down at the same time, so it continues working just like the derivatives are almost like an insurance vehicle. They can work. But let's say a nuclear bomb went off, obviously Allstate's going to be out of business. And that's kind of how I see the derivatives, where it does work. However, if you have something like multiple sovereign debt crises where debts go bad, people can't pay up, all of a sudden now you have a situation where the whole damn thing just implodes, correct?
Yeah, I think you're right on with that analogy. Just look at AIG back in 2008. At the time, the largest insurance company in the country, I believe in the world, but at least in the United States. And they got in a massive amount of trouble. All of a sudden, they needed huge government bailouts just to survive. Now, why? It's because of these derivatives. They had, and of what happened with the subprime mortgage meltdown and everything else. And all of a sudden, all of these, insurance contracts, these derivatives started going against them all at once. And that's the danger, because these banks, are so exposed because they've written essentially, as you described, kind of these insurance contracts. And if all of them start going bad all at once, that doesn't work. It only works if a few go bad at a time, like with an auto insurance company or things of that nature. So I think that your analogy is perfect. Right? It's right on.
Okay, Michael, with all the research you've done, are there any silver linings? Kind of two-part question. So first off, is there any realistic solution that could happen for the United States, either with government policy or, let's say, a boom in technology over the next few years? And then the second part is, what is the individual solution for a person, just an individual family? What should they be doing right now?
Right. Well, for a political solution coming out of Washington, D.C., I'm not optimistic at this point at all. People have been suggesting changes, reforms, things we need to do, but instead they've continued with the business as usual, made our problems even worse since the last financial crisis, the last go around. So I don't believe there will be a political solution or really any type of solution, because I believe we're so close to this next crisis, next major economic downturn now, that I don't believe that there's any possible way to avert it now. I believe if we would have been doing some things right after the last crisis, we could have done something, but not now. And so that's why I focus on people, on getting prepared on an individual, a community level, a family level, because I believe that's the key. Now, a lot of people ask me about financial preparation, and I believe that, there are people that are going to make a lot of money in this next crisis. Even as the markets are crashing, things are going crazy. Not everyone's going to lose money. Some people are going to actually make money. Some people are going to do well. I'm over the long term, and this is going to take a little while to play out, but I'm a big believer in gold and silver. I believe that particularly silver, it's last time I checked, it was 15 something an ounce. I mean, that's just ridiculously low. If you get into silver and hold it for the long term, I believe that over the coming years, you're going to be exceedingly happy with how that turns out. There's other ways to protect yourself from a market crash. Instead of being in stocks going up, there are things like inverse ETFs that people can get into, which will promise to do exceedingly well when markets crash, things of that nature. But then another thing on a very practical level I encourage people to do is build up an emergency fund. Because what happened in the last crisis? The last crisis, all of a sudden, the economic activity started to grind to a standstill. We had millions of people lose their jobs. And because most people were living paycheck to paycheck, they couldn't pay the mortgage. All of a sudden, people started losing their homes. So I encourage people to build up an emergency fund that can cover at least 6 months of expenses, so that if you do lose your job, if your business goes sour, you can still pay the bills, pay the mortgage, get food for your family, do the things you need to do. And then beyond that longer term, because I believe we're moving into a multi-year downturn, a multi-year crisis, which is going to get worse and worse. There will be swings and ups and downs, but I believe things are going to get progressively worse as we head into the rest of this decade. In the longer term, I do encourage people to start to store up food and supplies, things of that nature, to get a generator or some other alternative power source if power goes down, to have some emergency cash at home. If you can't get to the ATM like we saw in Cyprus, now we're seeing right now in Greece, if there is some kind of banking holiday or something causes the ATMs to shut down, have some emergency cash at home that you can use in the event of some kind of emergency like that. So anything you can do to become more independent of the system, I think is a good thing.
Michael Snyder of the economiccollapseblog.com. Thank you so much for your time. Very informative. I would love to touch base with you again in probably 3 or 4 months. Get an update. If there's anything that you urgently want to get out, please feel free to reach out to us. I'd love to talk to you again. This was one of the most informative conversations I've had with a guest. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I'd be glad to come back anytime.